This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Gwyn K, Polity, John H, Tanya T, Veronica S, Jeffrey B, Gabby, Helen M, Sunny H, Scott K, JRM, Susie G, Eldritch Priest, B Lupita, C Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B, CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G, V!V, Mary Beth R, Ida B, Eric N, Tana, and May. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content. So please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and our podcast this week is going to be about the Sirens. Now, the Sirens are one of the, I guess what you could call the bestiary of Greek mythology, of these feminine figures that tend to be associated with the water, or at least are somewhere, they're somewhere close to the water, or may specifically have to do with the water, and they tend to represent something, in this case, one of what they call the terrors of the sea. However, it's not clear that the Sirens' origins were as some kind of a sea beast or sea deity. In fact, their connection seems to be to the Muses. Now, their father is often conceived of as being a river god, who is called, let me see if I can say it right, Akaloios. That's how you would say the name. And the mother is considered to be, I think there's some other variations, but mainly either the daughter of Melpomene, who is one of the Muses, and interestingly, she's the muse that's connected to tragedy, or Akaloios and Terpsichore. Terpsichore being the muse connected to music and musical ability. So we have the Sirens as being connected to both music and tragedy, which makes sense if we think about the kind of role that they play in Greek mythology. The Sirens will, what they do is they are on their island, okay, and it's not always clear exactly what the island is. There's some theories about that, which we'll talk about a little bit, but they are definitely mentioned in both the Argonautica and the Odyssey, which, as we know in the Argonautica, the second half of the route of the route that the Argonauts take definitely mirrors that of Odysseus. In theory, the Argonautica is an earlier story. That's also known as the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. However, the version that we have of it that's written down is from, I think it's Apollonius of Rhodes who had written that one, and that came out more, it was closer to the Roman period, and it was actually more of a Roman translation of that particular story. And the Odyssey, as we know, was written by Homer, so at least in terms of a written text, the Odyssey comes before the Apollonius of Rhodes version of the Argonautica that we know from later on. Nonetheless, the story of Jason and the Argo was definitely mentioned in the Greek histories, so again, which one came first? There's probably different ways you could argue it, but from a literary perspective, the Odyssey came first. So the route that they take, basically you have Odysseus landing on the island of Kirke, and that's where she turns his men into pigs. And then later on, he has the moly plant that manages to ward off her spells that he gets from the god Hermaeus. And then she immediately, instead of trying to enchant him, or she tries to seduce him in a different way. And so then she becomes his sexual partner, and then she also volunteers to help him. Okay, because I guess in some way she feels like she's met her match with him. So they end up going to, this is where you have what they call the Nicaea in the Odyssey. They go to the underworld. They bring up the ghost of Tiresias, the prophet, who is able to tell Odysseus why he can't get home and also how he's going to get home. Now, in addition to this, we have the fact that Kirke gives Odysseus a whole lot of warning about what kind of dangers he's going to encounter as he tries to get home. And she mentions 3 specific dangers. She mentions the Sirens, which obviously that's a subject that we have today. She mentions Scylla and Charybdis, which I have previously done a podcast on. And then she also mentions the island of Helios and the cattle of the sun, which are basically the warning there is whatever you do, do not touch these cattle. Do not try to kill them. Do not try to eat them. Do not try to sacrifice them. Don't do anything with them at all, which of course Odysseus's men ignore. To be fair to them, they were stuck on the island for days and they were starving. So they felt that, what harm could there be in just doing a little of it? And then that was what ended up, when they did finally manage to get on the water again, that the whole ship was destroyed and Odysseus was left clinging to a single plank. And then that's where he floats to the island of Calypso, and he's stuck there for 7 years. So, in any case, that's within the Odyssey. And in the Argonautica, you would see Jason and his crew all following the same pathway. Now, the piece that we're actually specifically interested in here has to do with the Sirens. And now in the Argonautica, which I don't have a copy of in front of me, what happens is as they pass the island of the Sirens, and again, the warning is that the women sing with very, very beautiful voices, because the Sirens are these, like the Sphinx and lots of other feminine creatures, they are generally shown as being half woman and half bird, although in later medieval conceptions, they were often shown as mermaids. But originally, they are like the harpies. There's almost these bird-type women, so they are shown as having the heads of females and the bodies of birds. And later in the mermaid iconography, they might have been shown as having a fish tail, but also maybe having hands with bird claws or something like that. There was only some bird-type attribute connected to them. And so it's interesting also what they've tended to represent and how that representation changed over time. So in the Argonautica, what happens is they are passing by. I think actually I probably have a copy of it here that I can share with you. Yeah, we have an account from Apollonius of Rhodes, and this is what he says about the Sirens with regard to the Argonautica. And it says, before long they, meaning the Argonauts, sighted the beautiful island of Antimoessa, where the clear-voiced Sirens, Achilleos, yeah, I got that right, daughters, used to bewitch with their seductive melodies whatever sailors anchored there. Lovely Terpsichore, one of the Musae, or the Muses, had borne them to Achilleos, and at one time they had been handmaids to Demeter's gallant daughter, Persephone. Now we're going to talk about that story as well, before she was married and sung to her in chorus. But now, half human and half bird in form, they spent their time watching for ships from a height that overlooked their excellent harbor, and many a traveler, reduced by them to skin and bones, had forfeited the happiness of reaching home. The Sirens, hoping to add the Argonauts to these, made haste to greet them with a liquid melody, and the young men would soon have cast their hawsers on the beach if Thracian Orpheus had not intervened. Raising his Bistonian lyre, he drew from it the lively tune of a fast-moving song, so as to din their ears with a medley of competing sounds. The girlish voices were defeated by the lure, and the set wind, aided by the sounding backwash from the shore, carried the ship off. The Sirens' song grew indistinct, yet even so there was one man, Butes, the noble son of Teleon, who was so enchanted by their sweet voices that before he could be stopped he leapt into the sea from his polished bench. The poor man swam through the dark swell, making for the shore, and had he landed, they soon would have robbed him of all hope of reaching home. But Aphrodite, queen of Eryx, had pity on him. She snatched him up while he was still battling with the surf, and having saved his life, she took him to her heart and found a home for him on the heights of Lilybaean. Okay, so that's interesting. So our first story here is that the Sirens, that they try to they bewitch these passing ships, and they try to get the men to abandon ship and to come onto the island. And presumably the men die because they can't get off the island, and also because the Sirens have no means of feeding them. This island does not appear to have anything in the way of food, so they become stuck there, and they become skin and bones because they basically die of starvation. is what happens to them. So thus, the Song of the Siren is considered to be the song of death. And this is something I think that's an important motif here, because obviously we see this connection between them and the underworld. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of the Odyssey. I actually have my copy of Robert Fagel's translation of the Odyssey. But before I do that, I do want to talk about the other story that is connected with them, because as is mentioned in the story of Apollonius of Rhodes, we see the Sirens as being connected to the goddess Persephone. And so now the story of them is connected to Persephone is, okay, so let's see. I wanted to see which particular source I want to read from here. Okay, so according to Pseudo-Hyginus in the Fabulae, which is from the 2nd century CE, the Sirens, daughters of the river Achilleos and the muse Melpomene, wandering away after the rape of Persephone, or Proserpina in this version, came to the land of Apollo, and there were made flying creatures by the will of Kyris, or Demeter, because they had not brought help to her daughter. It was predicted they would live only until someone who heard their singing would pass by. So, in other words, the people who pass them by must necessarily die from hearing their song, and if somebody manages to pass by unhindered and not die, then the Sirens themselves would die. And indeed, after the episode in the Odyssey, it is said that they threw themselves in the water and they drowned themselves. Okay. So now there's two different versions, I have to say, of the story connected to Persephone, because yes, they are seen as handmaidens of Persephone who had beautiful voices and who sang to her. Okay. So once again, interesting that they're connected to Terpsichore, who is the muse connected to music and singing. So they have this musical ability, but that also they end up being connected to Melpomene. So we've got Apollonius of Rhodes says it's Terpsichore. Pseudo-Hyginus says it's Melpomene, and there's an inflection there that they are connected now to tragedy, to tragic death. And frequently when we talk about tragedy and tragic death, it's often like if we think about it in terms of literature, like in a Shakespearean play, a tragedy is where somebody dies at the end. A comedy is where people get married at the end. Bet you didn't know about Shakespeare, but that's kind of the that was really while comedy we also think about as something that makes us laugh. That was sort of the definition, was that the resolution at the end would be that some duke would appear somewhere and the people involved in the play would be married to each other somehow. Like there'd be this resolution that resulted in union. That was often defined as a comedy. A tragedy was defined as where there is no necessarily, that's terrible English, where there isn't necessarily a resolution, but instead that there is usually a death or a tragedy. So therefore, Romeo and Juliet, for example, even though that's frequently cited as a great love story, is actually a tragedy, because Romeo and Juliet I guess they do get married, but then, or they're supposed to get married, but they end up both dying in the end. He thinks Juliet is dead. So he kills himself, and then when she sees he's dead, she falls on the sword and kills herself. So yeah, it's not, and of course it turns out it would not have been, it wasn't what it appeared to be. So yeah, tragedy. And so tragedies have to do with death. So the idea is that the Song of the Siren, it's almost like there's the sweetness of something that one experiences that's ultimately going to lead to death. Now, where we also see this kind of concept in ancient literature, I think specifically of Proverbs in the Bible. Now, of course, the literature of the Israelites, the Hebrew literature, the biblical literature, is not necessary. I mean, I'm not drawing a line and saying, oh, Greek mythology was influenced by this. Okay, that's not really the idea. But there is the idea of what they would term as depending on the translation that you read, either the loose woman or the foreign woman. Okay, interesting that loose and foreign are somehow equated in different translations, and what that might mean. It's rather telling. But that the loose or foreign woman who will lead the man down to Sheol, which of course Sheol is the ancient Judaic name for the underworld, and maybe still a name that's used today. I don't know. It's interesting because Jewish eschatology, or even even the whole idea of Jewish life after death, is not. It's not discussed as robustly. Like, it's within Christianity and Islam that we have really strong ideas of like a heaven or a hell, and Judaism doesn't really quite have it like that. I mean, there's discussion of the fires of Gehenna, which might be sort of equivalent to hellfire, but again, it has to do more with the sacrifices made to another foreign god, and then and so the idea was that the one went to Sheol when they died. The whole theology of the harrowing of hell, as they call it, where Christ supposedly goes to hell and releases Moses and Abraham and all of those from this place that they're in, which is where what Dante would have described as the righteous pagans. This place that was not. I mean, this wasn't like that they were living in the parts of hell that had to do with punishment, shall we say? Maybe more equivalent of the Elysian fields, and now they are brought up to heaven. Once Christ comes down and redeems them. Obviously, that is a Christian concept. So, that's not definitely when we talk about the ancient Judaic underworld, we are talking about Sheol. And so the idea, though, is that the foreign woman, or the loose woman, in other words, the woman of loose morals, the one who's not going to abide by the law, the one who says, be free, right? The one who says, enjoying the beautiful song of earthly pleasure, shall we say. And it's interesting because later on the Sirens as mermaids were considered to be symbols where they were used of this kind of earthly pleasure. Sometimes they are portrayed holding like a mirror, a comb and a mirror. There's the idea of feminine beauty and grace as somehow being something that leads to death. And that has been a concept. That is the concept of the seductive anima. Okay, so let me tell you the story from the Odyssey. It's not a very long piece in the Odyssey. Let me open my book here. Okay, so this is in Homer's Odyssey. This is in book 12. And so we'll start with Kirke and what she says. So this is on page, if you have the Fagel's translation, it's page 276, around line 158. They swung aboard at once, they sat to the oars in ranks, and in rhythm churned the water white with stroke on stroke. And Kirke the nymph with glossy braids, the awesome one who speaks with a human voice, sent us a hardy shipmate, yes, a fresh following wind ruffling up in our wake, bellying out our sail to drive our blue prow on, as we, securing the running gear from stem to stern, sat back while the wind and helmsman kept her true on course. At last, and sore at heart, I told my shipmates, friends, it's wrong for only one or two to know the revelations that lovely Kirke made to me alone. I'll tell you all so we can die with our eyes wide open now, or escape our fate and certain death together. First she warns we must steer clear of the Sirens, their enchanting song, their meadow starred with flowers. Okay, so I guess there's flowers where they are, but not necessarily food. I alone was to hear their voices, so she said, but you must bind me with tight chafing ropes so I cannot move a muscle, bound to the spot, erect at the mast block, lashed by ropes to the mast. And if I plead, commanding you to set me free, then lash me faster, rope on pressing rope. Now, at this point, before I continue with the actual Siren account, it's interesting to note that the word siren comes from a word that means to bind or to entwine. So in a way, what we're talking about here is that Odysseus escapes being entwined by the Sirens, by allowing himself to be entwined instead by his men to his ship. So the question is, do you allow yourself to be seduced by the lovely voice of a woman, or are you sort of tied to your work? Are you tied to your desire for adventure or your desire to go home? Okay. Similarly, we see these other distractions that Odysseus has, like the lotus eaters, the island there where you can eat whatever you eat of the flowers there. That one falls into this kind of Piscean landscape where they're just completely. It's like basically being drugged all the time and not forgetting everything and not wanting to move forward, not wanting to do anything in life, just wanting to kind of prance among the flowers or whatever. But it's basically where young men can get stuck. There's a certain psychological aspect to that. So here it's almost like, yes, the Sirens are leading to And it's interesting because it's leading to a starvation. So the idea is that there is a sensuality that's implied, but it's implied that that sensuality is not actually something. It's something that's going to leave you starving rather than something that's going to fulfill you. So, okay, so I'll finish the little bit on the Sirens here from the Odyssey. So I informed my shipmates point by point. All the while our trim ship was speeding toward the Sirens' island, driven on by the brisk wind. But then the wind fell in an instant, all glazed to a dead calm. A mysterious power hushed the heaving swells. The oarsmen leapt to their feet, struck the sail, stowed it deep in the hold, and sat to the oarlocks, thrashing with polished oars, frothing the water white. Now with a sharp sword I sliced an ample wheel of beeswax down into pieces, kneaded them in my 2 strong hands, and the wax soon grew soft, worked by my strength, and Helios's burning rays, the sun at high noon, and I stopped the ears of my comrades one by one. They bound me hand and foot in the tight ship, erect at the mast block, lashed by ropes to the mast, and rode and churned the white cap stroke on stroke. We were just offshore, as far as a man's shout can carry, scudding close, when the Sirens sensed at once a ship was racing past, and burst into their high, thrilling song. Come closer, famous Odysseus, Achaea's pride and glory. Moor your ship on our coast so you can hear our song. Never has any sailor passed our shores in his black craft until he has heard the honeyed voices pouring from our lips. And once he hears, to his heart's content sails on a wiser man. And of course, we know that isn't true. We know all the pains that Greeks and Trojans once endured on the spreading plain of Troy when the gods willed it so. All that comes to pass on the fertile earth, we know it all. So they sent their ravishing voices out across the air, and the heart inside me throbbed to listen longer. I signaled the crew with frowns to set me free. They flung themselves at the oars and rowed on harder. Perimedes and Eurylochus, springing up at once to bind me faster with rope on chafing rope. But once we'd left the Sirens fading in our wake, once we could hear their song no more, their urgent call, my steadfast crew was quick to remove the wax I'd used to seal their ears and loosed the bonds that lashed me. Okay, so that's the end of the episode in the Odyssey. It does not say that the Sirens drowned themselves. That was a later Roman extrapolation from the text. I was talking about Demeter and Persephone, and like a lot of times in these podcasts, I tend to sidetrack myself. But I was going to say that the way that it was represented by pseudo-Hyginus is that that the Sirens were actually being punished by being given bird wings for not protecting Persephone. But in other versions, they were given bird wings so that they could fly above and that they could actually try to see where she went. So in other words, it was just to give them perspective, to help them so that they could help in the search. But we don't see any evidence that the Sirens actually were able to find her. Eventually, it was Helios speaking to Hecate who is able to say to be able to tell Demeter what happened to Persephone. Because again, the sun chariot would see all. And the sun represents that kind of clarity that one has, that clear vision that one has with sight. So, okay. So it's interesting. So those are the stories that we hear about the Sirens. There are a few others that I will get into. In one version from Pausanias, it says that at Coronea in Boeotia is a sanctuary of Hera. In her, meaning the statue's hands, she carried the Sirens. For the story goes that the daughters of Achilleus were persuaded by Hera to compete with the Muses in singing. The Muses won, plucked out the Sirens' feathers, and made crowns for themselves out of them. Now that's interesting. In this one, they're supposed to be the children of the Muses, but now they're actually asked to go up against the Muses in a singing contest. And of course that they lost, and so therefore the Muses are taking their feathers, which is interesting because the feathers are what would allow them, you would presume, as birds, what would allow them flight. So this makes them flightless. So in other words, they have if we think of the song as something that's carried on the air, and if we think of that as being a power of the air, I've talked in other podcasts about the way in which seductive women tend to be associated with demonic beings of the air, which is really interesting. They tend to have this idea of being connected with that, probably because birds and flight are connected to the soul, and the idea was that the soul could fly. In fact, it was one of the things that was theorized is that the wings of the sirens may actually be reminiscent of what they call the ba bird in Egyptian mythology. And the ba is that aspect of you as a human that survives after death. That part of the soul that survives and then joins the ka. But it takes the form of a bird with a human head. So certainly in the earliest renderings that we see of the sirens, this is the way that they're portrayed. And of course, Pausanias is writing, in the 2nd century CE. This is where we get a lot of these writings, but clearly the stories of the sirens, if they go back to Homer, then they're clearly much older than that. And whenever you're dealing with Roman reinterpretations, I mean, sometimes the Romans are just the ones to write it down. But like any later culture that writes something down, we don't know how much of the original myth is actually retained there. So there's something about the sirens and the death of the centaurs, too. I'm looking at theoi.com right now. Lycophron from Alexandria, 3rd century BCE. Others, meaning Odysseus, shall wander the narrow meet of the Tyrrhenian Strait and the watching place fatal to the hybrid monsters, the centaurs, and the rocks of the harpy-limbed nightingales, meaning the sirens. And that's interesting because here they're compared to nightingales. What sterile nightingale killer of Cantori? These are the sirens who he called the killers of Cantoroi. Okay. Killers of Cantoroi, or centaurs. The centaurs who fled from Heracles through Chthonia in Italy perished of hunger, ensnared by the soft song of the sirens. Okay. So again, you have the idea of the centaurs. So what are the centaurs? They are usually... They have usually the legs of a goat, and they have the upper body of a human. They're connected to, they tend to have a connection to satyrs. Although centaurs are also said to be the more intelligent ones, because the centaurs tend to be the teachers or the mentors. Achilles is taught by a centaur. In fact, Chiron, who we frequently talk about with regard to the comet. Astrologically, it's a comet, I think, called Chiron, that we always talk about is the wound in your astrological chart, the Chiron wound, because Chiron actually is accidentally wounded by Heracles with one of his poison arrows, and because Chiron is immortal, he can't die. But here we have these centaurs who can die, and it's that they die at the hands of the sirens. So in other words, these are the centaurs who represent rationality and intelligence, and it's among these kinds of creatures that we associate with the forests and the caves and maybe the knowledge of the earth. And what they do is by allowing themselves to be taken in by the sirens, they too perish. So again, there's some symbolism there about the perishing of the intellect at the hands of the seductive quality of the anima. Interesting, too, that Circe is the one, or Circe, as some people like to call her, is the one who warns Odysseus, because she is an anima. She's kind of a potentially seductive / toxic anima figure herself. And so it could be a case of takes one to know one. So we've talked about the Argonautica. I'm just looking through some of these other versions that we have here on Theoi and all of the different references to that. So, and that's interesting. Telemachus this was New History, Book 7 by Ptolemy Hephaestion, claimed that Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, was put to death by the Sirens when they learned he was the son of Odysseus. So that would refute the story that they all threw themselves in the water and drowned themselves after Odysseus passed by. And there's some poetic fragments that mention them as well. That's interesting. Okay, the cult of the Sirens in southern Italy and Naples. And again, this is Lycophron in Alexandria. It says, "He, Odysseus, shall slay the triple daughters, the Sirens, of Thetis' son Achilleos. Achilleos. I don't know why I have a hard time saying that. Achilleos, okay. Who imitated the strains of their melodious mother, Melpomene." So there's the idea almost that because they are not really the Muses, that they're really only an imitation of the Muses. So that's interesting. So they have the qualities of the Muses, but somehow they're an imitation. And that's actually an interesting thought too, because if they're an imitation of the Muses, then they're not. Then there's the implication that there's something disingenuous about their song. Okay, that there's something about it that is off, or that is not the beautiful inspiration that it claims to be. That there's something tricksterish about it, almost. Okay, so let's see. Self-hurled from the cliff's top, they dive with their wings in the Tyrrhenian Sea, where the bitter thread spun by the Morai, the Fates, shall draw them. One of them, Parthenope, okay, so now we have some names of the Sirens, washed ashore the tower of Phaleros, one of them, Parthenope, washed ashore the tower of Phaleros shall receive, and Glanus wetting the earth with its streams. There the inhabitants shall build a tomb for the maiden, and with the libations and sacrifice of oxen shall yearly honor the bird goddess Parthenope. And Leucosia shall be cast on the jutting strand of Enipus, and shall long haunt the rock that bears her name, where Rapid is and neighboring Laris pour forth their waters. Okay, so this is where we actually see the Sirens named. Parthenope, and then we have Leucosia, and so then we have Ligeia, which is actually a name used by Edgar Allan Poe, interestingly enough, shall come across the shore at Tyrrhenia, spitting out the wave. And her shall sailormen bury on the stony beach, nigh to the eddies of Oceanarus. And ox-horned heirs shall lave her tomb with his streams, cleansing with his waters the foundation of her whose children were turned into birds. And there one day, in honor of the first goddess of the sisterhood, shall the ruler of the navy, Popsops, which is a historical Athenian admiral, Diotimos, array for his mariners a torch race in obedience to an oracle, which one day the people of the Neapolitans shall celebrate. Okay. So in other words, they're saying in Naples that there are these monuments to the Sirens who have washed ashore there and who are buried there. And that there should be not only there's kind of races or games. When we think of the Olympics, they might have even started out as these kinds of games where, because certainly games were associated with funerary rites and may have also been associated with these kinds of festivals. So, yeah, so supposedly this is where the Sirens are honored as bird goddesses in Naples. So that's rather interesting. And then we have the name, and the islands seem to be named for them as well. And, okay, so... yeah, so we've got some interesting things. Now, of course, how many Sirens are there? That's another question, because depending on the version, there's anywhere between 2 and 8. That one that we just read about the cult of the Sirens, or the place where they might have been worshipped or honored, mentions 3 of them. But there is, if you go to the Wikipedia article on the Sirens, actually, they have a whole chart showing, where they're supposed to be from and what they're supposed to look like and how many of them there are and who their parents might be. Because there's some who say that Gaia and Oceanus are their parents. Most of them say that they're the child of Achilleus and the Muse. One says that Chthonia, which is the earth, is actually another name for the earth, is their mother. And then, yeah, there's actually other muses that are mentioned as well. They show either being 2, 3, or 4 of them. Most seem to show that there's 3. And again, individual names, I mentioned those, but apparently there are a whole, let me count how many there are. 15 different possible names for the Muses, depending on the source that you read from. So, yeah, I'm not going to go through all of the names. But, yeah, so now Ovid is the one who says that the Sirens are companions of Persephone. Demeter gave them wings to search for Persephone. Okay, so that's where we have that story. And then, yeah, and Hyginus is the one who claims that it was a punishment. So let's okay. So we're looking at a lot of these different stories. I think we have looked at most of the stories that are mentioned about them. Here's one from Pliny where he asserts that they exist in India and charm men by their song, having first lulled them to sleep. That's interesting that India is mentioned there. Okay, so if we just let's step back and take a look at some of the symbolism here. We know about the idea of the siren song, and frequently you will hear women who are considered to be, say, luring a married man away from his partner or something like that, as somebody who is a siren, right? There's this siren. Usually it's considered to be somebody who's very beautiful, and somebody who is very sexually appealing, and that therefore this person is luring somebody off their path into something that's not going to lead to anything good. In fact, it's supposed to, in the mythology, is quite literally leading to the death. But it's interesting, and actually there is, some people have actually concluded that the reason that the men waste away is because they're eaten or devoured by the Sirens, which is interesting, because now you get into this devouring feminine archetype. I don't think the earlier stories necessarily imply that. They imply more that the men die there of starvation because they can't go anywhere. But nonetheless, whether you're talking about famine or whether you're talking about devouring, you are talking about very toxic aspects of the feminine, or very negative ones that have the effect of bringing death. Now, this is interesting. In the Book of Enoch, early Christian and medieval sources, that the Sirens actually, according to Enoch, are women who were led astray by the fallen angels. So the angels that come down to mate with humans, apparently those women are turned into Sirens. Which, again, there you see this idea, because the fallen angels are drawn away from their duty to mate with the women of the earth. Similarly, the Sirens represent that force that of something that appears to be beautiful but actually leads to death or to being quote-unquote fallen in this sense. And there is some argument here about whether or not the early Christian church literally believed in Sirens, or whether or not whether they just simply used them as symbols for this kind of worldly life and worldly temptation that one shouldn't succumb to. In fact, that's what Ambrose of the 4th century said. The Siren stood as a symbol for worldly temptation and not as an endorsement of the Greek myth. And then Clement of Alexandria saying they represent the vice of pleasure. And Isidorus, the early Christian euhemerist interpretation of mythologized human beings, received a long-lasting boost from the Etymology by Isidore of Seville, which was written around 560 to 636 CE. It says, the Greeks, imagine that there were 3 sirens, part virgins, part birds, with wings and claws. One of them sang, another played the flute, the third the lyre. Okay, so this one there was 3. They drew sailors, decoyed by song to shipwreck. According to the truth, however, they were prostitutes who led travelers down to poverty and were said to impose shipwreck on them. So, the woman you get involved with. Okay, so there's another angle. The idea, when we talk about the idea of marriage, we've seen all kinds of narratives about women who don't follow the proper track, becoming assistants of the Furies or turning into these kinds of creatures that are like Lamia or Mormo or Gello. Here we have this idea of these representing a force that men need to be aware of the woman who is the prostitute and will lead them into poverty. Hence the idea of famine there as well. So in other words, she's not a woman who lacks abundance. She lacks abundance. She's not a person who has money and position. So that would be a kind of inflection of the idea that that's why one should marry somebody who's going to give them good social standing or give them enough of an income, and why they should not bother themselves with women who don't have this. Who are, of course, are being treated as prostitutes. Now, if we think about the idea of prostitution, probably in, between the major eras of the Greek and Roman time period there, prostitutes weren't necessarily poor. And the term prostitute often tends to be used for a woman who is perhaps worldly and independent. So that's something else that one needs to think about. There's a lot of theories about Mary Magdalene as actually being a wealthy and independent woman. And you will frequently hear in Cicero and other places about men who are patronized by a woman who has money and status and who maybe own something in their own right, as opposed to acquiring their wealth through marriage or through a husband or being subject to a husband. So it's also worth noting that when we talk about this idea of prostitution, it's also this idea of the woman who is independent of whatever the social norm is. And so here they were saying it's that she is, they're associated with this poverty here. So it says, they drew sailors decoyed by song to shipwreck. Okay, prostitutes, they had wings and claws because love flies and wounds. They are said to have stayed in the waves because a wave created Venus, or Aphrodite. Now, if you go back to the story of Aphrodite and the fact that name Aphrodite literally means foam born, and she is born out of the churning waters when Uranus's male member is cut off by Kronos or Saturn, and it lands in the ocean. And there are several things that are born out of that, including giants, but the goddess Aphrodite is said to have been born. So basically, Aphrodite comes out of the sea. She's the daughter of the sky and the sea, basically. This comes out of that. She comes out of that particular milieu, that place. And so, and that the sirens stay in the waves or near the waves because the waves created Venus. So this is interesting because this definitely associates the sirens with love, or with the aspects of love that are considered to be tricky, because it flies and it wounds. So they end up becoming metaphorical of love in a weird kind of a way. Maybe this is why they are transformed into mermaids, these beautiful maidens who could potentially lead sailors astray in some way. And love flies. So in other words, you fall in love with somebody, and love can come and go just as quickly as it comes. It can leave, if you were talking about the fleeting passion of romance, and that love can also wound. So many of us, a lot of the work I do outside of Chthonia with healing work and stuff, when you deal with heart work, a lot of people have very, very closed hearts because they have been wounded. And it's not that they're not kind people or not nice people, but when it comes to letting others get close in a particular kind of a way, there is a definite barrier that's set up. And it's because we've been wounded. You stick your hand in the fire, you're going to be really close, really careful about sticking your hand in again. So it's, yeah. And it's interesting, too, that in the Argonautica, that the one sailor who does jump is rescued by Aphrodite. Okay, so even though the goddess of love is not associated with the parentage of the sirens in any way, we're seeing this connection between, she has a favoritism towards them in a way, or at least she seems to look favorably upon them because they are connected to the art of love. It's the idea of luring, that seducing quality that one sees in love. So there's, so it's very interesting what we see here. And again, as I've mentioned, these are not the only feminine figures that we see that aren't connected, that are, part human and part something else, that tend to be connected with either, love, seduction, sexuality, or certainly just knowledge of the earth. I mean, one might argue that the Sphinx, for example, in the Oedipal myth, that the Sphinx is a representation of the Chthonic. She is that zoomorph, that hybrid of different types of animals coming together in one being. And so she questions, Oedipus about what the she questions people about what her riddle actually means, and when people can't tell her what she represents, she devours them. Okay, like you would with the feminine. Maybe I should do a podcast on the Sphinx too. But when Oedipus comes along and says, "Oh well, you're talking about a human," this may be. This was certainly Peter Redgrove's thesis, is that this may have been the way in which the human rationality and human ways of seeing and being are considered to be, the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx, and then she flies away at this, like, anguished, because there's this assertion of this kind of masculine rationality. But then when Oedipus realizes that his sight and what he sees in front of him, and his rationalization of things and his codes was wrong, then interestingly he puts his eyes out, right? So, that's just kind of a side thing, but it has to do with the idea that these kinds of figures, like the sirens, tend to be representations of these aspects of the feminine that are difficult to grapple with, and their qualities and attributes may be defined according to what people perceive as the results. Because we often talk about, like, don't get involved with that woman, it's no good. She's going to lead you astray. She's going to make a fool out of you. She's going to, in some way, the woman who doesn't feel like she has to abide by the rules is the one who is the troublemaker, right? This is the one who's going to lead to a bad result. And just as the woman who doesn't fulfill her conjugal duty and get married and have a family becomes connected to the Furies, becomes connected to these figures on the edges that you need to be careful of, okay, or ones that might steal your children from you and that kind of thing. Now, but it's interesting. One of the things I just had a thought about that when I was talking about that. When we see the Sirens as representing this independence, we do have to go back to the myth of Demeter and Persephone. And if their original role, okay, if they're born of a river god and one of the Muses, okay, or regardless, they have a watery connection here, and they're connected to both tragedy and to music. If they were originally meant to be handmaidens of Persephone, and Persephone is the goddess of she's a goddess who is the daughter of the earth goddess, one of the versions of the earth mother, Demeter, who is the one who allows the goddess of agriculture. She allows grain to grow and things like that. And Persephone's abduction, the fact that the Sirens don't help her. So the question becomes, well, what does that mean? What does that mean that the Sirens don't assist? We don't know. Again, depends on the inflection of the story. We don't know if they were there, saw her get taken away, and didn't do anything about it, which is almost the implication of Hyginus's account. You know, you could have helped and you didn't. Like, in other words, you had this singing voice, but then you were silent. And so with the mistress being carried away to the realm of death, the Sirens now just sing the songs that lead to death, right? There's that possible inflection there. It's one way to think about it, possibly. Not the only way. The other possibility, though, is that for whatever reasons, they didn't see the abduction happen, because we don't see any evidence that they, as her assistants, ever reported to Demeter what they saw. And in which case, that might have been more kind of neglect, too. Like, you were off doing something else and not paying attention to Persephone, and this happened. Like, if you're supposed to be there not only to assist her, but maybe to protect her in some way. And that's the question, too. Were the Sirens supposed to assume this kind of protective role with her? And the fact that they didn't see, it's just kind of like, okay, well, you didn't protect her, now you need to help find her. So they are given wings and they are allowed to fly through the air. But see, that's really, it's really futile because Persephone has been taken under the earth. And so, therefore, any attempt of them to fly over or to fly around to find her, of course, if they stay near water, we do know that water, as we've talked about many times, has a strong underworld association. But they seem to be out of range of whatever is happening with Persephone in the underworld. Now, the Persephone story, not to digress into that, because that is a separate podcast, but Persephone is, she's okay, she tends to represent, at least if we look at the psychological aspect of it, she tends to represent the girl on the edge of womanhood, the girl at Monarch, at that point where she is going to go into having, monthly menstruation and so forth, that's the point, that's at least the biological point at which the body switches over from being a girl's body to being a woman's body. Young woman nonetheless, but biologically that's the shift point that you look for. And that's usually when breasts develop, when one goes from having a straight up and down body to having a hips that kind of jut out more and having maybe a curved, waist that curves in. I think what we think of as the feminine shape develops around the same time that a woman also gets her first period. So these all happen kind of around the same time. Just as with men, they have their own things that happen to them with the cracking of the voice and development of what they call the Adam's apple in the throat, and the way in which their own member starts to behave at that point in time, and they might be heading towards growing different body hair and stuff like that. Like I said, the hormonal development happens differently in different people. So Persephone represents the girl at that point for women. And so she is, in a sense, sacrificed to the underworld, because the idea is that now that you are shedding blood, it's like you're almost part of this like monthly Chtonic ritual. It's a ritual that has to do with what we think of as the moon, because periods tend to go on 28-day cycles, the same as the moon. And so now she's reached this point where she's been kind of taken over by the Chthonic realm in a certain way. And with Hades taking her away, he's sort of this kind of dark, scary, masculine representation. Although, again, it's not entirely clear. I mean, yes, we can say, well, he's her uncle, and that's gross. But you have to remember, in Greek mythology, the intermarriages within the family are a thing. It doesn't have anything. That's hard. That's a hard thing for people to get past a lot of the time, because they're looking and they're going like, ew, that's her uncle. But you have to remember, Zeus is married to his sister. And, and supposedly Zeus and Persephone, that being his niece, produced Dionysus, at least in the Orphic version of the myth. And, there's all kinds of mythologies where they're the gods that are basically either siblings or relatives of each other. In a certain sense, they're all related to each other. And they may be mating with each other. So you really have to kind of get past that, because, as I've often said, when you're dealing with gods, you're not dealing with human laws, ethics, and morals. Like, that's always the first mistake, is to think that gods and the forces that they represent behave anything like humans. Yes, we see some things, aspects of the way their stories are told, that make them seem like they're like, we use these kinds of human ideas, like Zeus running around on his wife or different things. They tend to represent behaviors, if anything. If we're going to look at, again, strictly from a psychological standpoint, they tend to represent certain aspects of behavior and maybe certain aspects of nature, which is why you have other daemonic figures as well that may have to do with other aspects of our psychology. But still, the gods are supposed to be the ones that kind of these ruling factors or factions. And to a certain degree, when you have a cult of the 12, like you do with the Olympian gods, you're talking about a group of gods that represents a social reality or a social psychology. So they are, So when you see this kind of a thing, and then we think about Persephone, she represents that girl who is, she's sort of devoted to Artemis, okay, which means being a virgin, devoted to her virginity. But then she's taken away by Hades, and Hades is the king of the underworld. So he has this almost, at least in some versions, and this is kind of how I see him just based on my reading of the Greek text, is that he's kind of got this bad boy image. And so it's almost like he's like the dark, handsome stranger that you're not supposed to be attracted to, right? Like that's the guy you're supposed to stay away from. So he has to almost sneak her into the underworld. He has to abduct her and take her away, away from the eyes of her mother, because if he approached Demeter and said, and then tried to arrange this marriage that way rather than through his brother Zeus, then Demeter never would have been like, absolutely not. You're not taking my daughter to the underworld. So he kind of does it in a sneaky kind of a way. And the Sirens, they become these singers of tragedy because they don't see this happening, at least from the perspective of Demeter. But we see that Persephone does fall into her role as queen of the underworld, although she does also spend time in the above world, which again seems to connect her with the cycles of the seasons and things like that, at least in one sense, if we look at her as a nature deity. But the idea that the Sirens, her attendants, now become birds. And we also think about later ideas that what we consider to be these feminine spirits, even a goddess like Morrigan, in a bird form, is considered to be a kind of underworld spirit. It's interesting because the Sirens end up kind of being this force that flies above, okay? So it's flying. They're connected with the water. They have wings so they can fly. And they're also connected with, to a certain degree, with death and the underworld. So they kind of represent this other aspect of the feminine that is... Again, this is an aspect of the feminine that moves outside of the normal social circles. And even Persephone's marriage to her uncle Hades is something, certainly, it's one of those things that there's just an element to it where she's entering womanhood, and it's really, in spite of what people say about that story, to me it's not entirely clear where Persephone stands. The last lines of the story, when her mother finds her, and she says to her mother, well, he tricked me, and he basically, like, he gave her a love charm. He tricked her, and now I'm in love with my husband. I've never ever been convinced by that line. I'm always just kind of like, that's a thing. Like when your mother catches you with the person you're not supposed to be with, you go, well, you kind of try to find some kind of an excuse to make it sound like it wasn't entirely you, just because you're trying to save face in the moment. But, there's moving into womanhood is one of those things that's very, very, it can be very, as much as it opens up this whole world of sexuality, it can also be very terrifying at the same time. And so I feel that the Persephone story represents that. And if the Sirens are part of that story, then they kind of represent these tragic aspects of trying to come into relationship, masculine and feminine trying to come into relationship. As I mentioned earlier, archetypes bring the mother and father. Mother and father are the archetypes that that one's own parents have, or the people who stand in as your parents get that archetype projected onto them, because they represent that mother with a capital M or father with a capital M, whether they play that role to the way you expect or not. And then when one gets older and now has to leave their parents and start becoming an independent adult, then their connection with the feminine and masculine has more to do with the anima animus. And these are all figures that are representations. Persephone represents that shift from dealing with mother, or maybe even with father, although she seems to spend most of her time with her mother, to now dealing with the masculine in an animus form, and in this kind of dark, scary animus form that Hades represents. And thus the Sirens become these kinds of singers of tragedy in some way, and they represent those aspects of love that fall outside of the social norm. The as they say later in the medieval text, the prostitute that one picks up with and falls in love with, but who has no money, or the one who is, there's this. There's just this element, or the idea of you're going to be taken in by the sweetness of this woman, and but you're going to starve to death, because ultimately whatever nourishment is promised there is not delivered. So in other words, it's like a false song. They're false muses. It's like a false song. You're being led astray by a song that is not a true one. That is not a true calling. But again, a lot of this is ethical editorializing, and one has to consider that this particular mythology of the Sirens and this interpretation of the Sirens takes place in a milieu that is definitely is suggesting a certain social developmental path for men and women. Okay, that women are supposed to be properly married and start families. And of course, and even with the men, they are supposed to also become properly married and have families. There's a certain amount of philandering that seems to be tolerated. And you have the Olympian gods as having it being kind of a psychological reflection of different aspects of this order. But when you have these kind of lesser, we'll call them lesser beings, or these more chthonic or liminal beings like the Sirens, who represent this, the sweet song that is... There's something that somehow has something not entirely true about it, or that's going to lead to this other kind of result. It's interesting. But without any kind of judgment on the morals of that, I do tend to look at it as the way in which there is almost a moral undertone, regardless, about certain aspects of our psychology or certain decisions that we make about relationship that could have negative effects. So, interesting. Like I said, I always tend to take a more sympathetic view of the Chthonic. I don't want to write off every figure of the Chthonic as something representing an evil. So I don't see the Sirens as evils. I see them as representing a certain aspect of archetypal psychology. It's a certain aspect of the way in which love works, and the way that it can short circuit if we don't know properly how to manage it. The way in which people can be led astray from whatever their path is or whatever their work is. And truthfully, even though this is about men, men being led astray by women, there's women who can be led astray by men too. Or even in same-sex partnerships, this can happen as well. It's not a foregone conclusion that your partner is always going to be the one who's going to provide you with that perfect happiness and fulfillment. And that may be fundamentally what the Sirens represent. But and again, not to reduce it to that single narrative, but that does seem to be the inflection there to some degree. Anyway, you can let me know what you think. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy these episodes and you are not a member of my Patreon, please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. And I thank my patrons always at the beginning of the episodes, and that is certainly a benefit of membership. I also provide early access to episodes, and people at the $5 level and above, I try to do extra podcasts every month, and of course, there's obviously more frequent updates about what I'm doing. And sometimes the things that I do publicly on public live streams, I may have another version that I will also have for Patreon subscribers. Also trying to get more courses and things together. That is the one thing I have just not gotten together this year with everything else going on. But I'm hoping to get back into getting this new school set up. Right now, I've been working more on the other side, transition life coaching, which is my other business. Working more on coursework and things for that, but I definitely am getting on the hopper of making some plans for the school I was talking about, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Feminine Myth, which I am going to try to put together with a few faculty to start and have it be a school situation that is inexpensive, but will allow people to examine things that maybe they only did as that in a university setting you would only take as a quick gen ed kind of course or something, or maybe something people feel that they can't major in for a job or whatever, but there may be something they have a genuine interest in. This allows people to explore those kinds of concepts outside of, with faculty who are university trained, but also who are capable of, explicating these kinds of concepts and having discussions and maybe even doing projects in them. So anyway, my social media. If you want to follow me, if you don't follow me on social media, I am Chthonia Podcast, one word. That's on Instagram. That is on X, although I'm not on X very often, just so you know, but you can follow me there. Facebook, it's Chthonia Podcast, two words. And on YouTube, it's listed as just Chthonia, though if you do at Chthonia Podcast, one word, you can find the channel when you search it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next episode.